Hello, students. We are getting to number 3. We're going to show that the diagonals of a rhombus bisect the opposite angles, which means a diagonal is an angle bisector. All right. So let's take a look at how we would go through and prove this. And I will jump to sharing here. Okay. And let's see here. See if we can get a little autofocus. There we go. All right. So we start with a rhombus. Now remember, rhombus has all 4 sides congruent. So just start with a rhombus. We'll call it A, B, C, D, as we've done so far. And again, all 4 sides are congruent. We already proved that one in the last video. Okay, so A, B, C, D is a rhombus. All 4 sides are congruent. All right. Okay, so now now that we know we've got a rhombus, all 4 sides are congruent, we're going to try to prove that AC creates beautiful and perfect angle bisections. Let's see. So we're going to draw AC, and AC is congruent to AC by reflexive. Okay, so make tick marks here. Now, last time I did ABC with CDA, and that's because I wanted parallel lines. But because of the side property, I could actually show that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle ADC by side. Okay, so starting at A, going out to D, then going up to C for both of them because the sides are indeed congruent. Right? Well, that's great. So that's congruent, which means that angle BAC is congruent to angle DAC, and angle BCA is congruent to angle DCA. And both of these are by CPCTC. Let's take a look. This angle down here has to be, because it's a corresponding part, and the angle up here on top has to be as well, because it is a corresponding part. And again, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So what that says right here is that AC bisects angles, big angle BAD and big angle BCD. Okay. Now, nothing about this proof is critical to the actual picture that I have drawn. I could have drawn in diagonal BD and then created triangles BAD and BCD and made the exact same argument. So what we will say is, similarly, BD bisects angles. Let's see, here's a BD would bisect angle ABC and angle ABC and ADC. Okay. And if you need to, you can kind of sketch that one in and kind of say, okay, so this one cuts across here. It's congruent to itself, and then side, side, and the middle side. 2 sides plus a third. We have congruent triangles, and we're perfect. We're in good shape. All right. So that's the idea. If you need to use something about angle bisectors, if you need an angle bisector, now we know we just draw a rhombus. Okay, there you go. So that is the beauty of that piece. And let's go back and just double check, make sure that I've got it down. So each diagonal of a rhombus bisects the opposite angle. So we just proved that had to be true. And there we go. All right. That's it for this one. I'll come back with number 4 and 5. Those two kind of go nicely together because, again, we're going to make congruent triangles using the diagonals. So we'll see how those work in the next video. All right, off you go.